Hello everyone. How are we all doing today? I hope we're doing well. I hope you're taking good care of yourselves. My cam is being really slow. Let me just stop and start this. Hopefully this will start working better. Much better. That is the snappy camera that I'm expecting. How are we all doing? I hope we're all keeping to a reasonable level of health today. It's good. We're good if we all were. So we've got plenty to talk about today, including a bunch of stuff about the obviously Super Thursday elections happened last week, the fallout from there, or everything that's been going on over the past however many days, all the discussion, all the different people having their interesting political takes, which we will be able to go over and have a look and see the veracity of these claims and whether anyone is actually anyone's existing in the real world, the kind of propaganda that's being thrown around. That's been interesting to talk about. Going to be going over a Lauren Southern video where she did a conservative critique of capitalism, which I'll be very, very interested to hear from my perspective. And then another video that was put into my mentions previously, and also talking about voter ID and the way in which the Conservatives are pushing forward this policy, moving up for the next election, also taking away second preferences in favour of first past the post for mayoral elections as well. So plenty to get through today. How is everyone in chat doing? I hope we're all okay. Anyone there? Let me just have a look. We're around see if we have some chatters to turn up, and then we'll be able to get on with everything that's going on today. I put my comment. I was going live in the wrong place. Hello, Jack. How are you doing? You keeping well? Trying to get people on board with the stream before I actually have a look into the topics that we're talking about today. What's been going on with you as well? I've not seen you in ages. Not since I moved flat. Oh, hey, Kath as well. So anyway, let us talk about. Now I've got some people actually in the chat. Let's have a talk about Thursday. So what happened? There was a shift in voting in council elections. So let's have a look. So first of all, there was council elections, there were mayoral elections, there was Welsh and Scottish parliamentary elections, and also a by-election, all happening at once. This is under the cover of post-pandemic, again, coming out at the end of the pandemic. Obviously the vaccines had an impact on this. We've got Keir Starmer's Labour, the Labour Party, going in there with some messaging, not very much. What has actually happened in the actual electoral results? So, in England, lots of rural council seats and places that weren't in big cities or in inner city areas or built up areas, Labour lost lots of councils. They lost control of lots of councils. There was a shift of voting preference in some city areas from Labour to Green as well. So that was the main thing you saw there. In Hartlepool, this is a big by-election because it's essentially going to be a framing of the post-Corbyn Labour Party in the way that it was being able to combat Boris Johnson as a political force. The Hartlepool, which has been a British seat that's gone to the Labour Party for 50-odd years, something like that, has finally turned the Conservatives, having gotten more votes under Jeremy Corbyn than they did under Tony Blair, has then moved from Labour to the Conservatives now. Due to this by-election. So that's the main things here in England, as well as some mayoral elections, which were mostly won by Labour candidates, apart from it was West Midlands went to the Conservatives, and there's a West Yorkshire one coming up pretty soon. So West Yorkshire was won by Labour, which means the Labour seat in Batley and Spen is going to be another by-election coming up soon, so that's going to be worth looking out for as well. So that's the pitch that you see from England: a shifting votes in rural areas, and mostly an overall loss of quite a lot of council control from Labour over to the Conservatives and the Greens in England. Second of all, you have the Welsh Parliament elections, which were a swing to Labour, mostly from Plaid Cymru and also from UKIP as well. So they went from being in minority control into being into giving a working majority under Mark Drakeford, who was a trade unionist, which is nice. And Plaid Cymru lost seats, and the Conservatives gained seats as well. So a bit of a post-Brexit realigning of Welsh politics now that UKIP weren't as a political force to actually be reckoned with in that area, which was interesting to see how different that was from the English elections as well. And then in Scotland, you saw the SNP increase their plurality, but fall short of a majority as well as some gains for the Conservatives, and Labour pretty much staying similar to where they were previously, as the intensity for a new referendum on Scottish independence increases over time. So that's the facts of the matter. Let's have a look into what's happening. Now, one thing I'm hearing a lot of is the losses in the Labour vote in England are the hot button issue topic, because what's happened is Keir Starmer's then been giving a lot of criticisms, is bitterly disappointed. It was very, very big swing in a lot of key areas from Labour to the Conservatives, both in councils and in the Hartlepool by-election. And he has said he takes full responsibility for it, and then sacked Angela Rayner as the party chair, which is a really funny way of taking responsibility. Also replacing Annalise Dodds with Rachel Reeves, big fan of, famous anti-Semite Nancy Astor, who also claimed that she wanted to crack down on people on benefits, which is a very super Labour pop position to have, apparently. Honestly surprised that Green gained some seats with how far the Labour Party's going, and see left-leaning Labour voters making the switch over. Yeah, that you're not surprised. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, and jumping off from that, there is a big shift rightwards in Labour Party kind of outlook, not policy, because they're not produced. Keir Starmer isn't producing any policies. He's not talking about any kind of policies or any kind of vision. He's just making platitudes, standing in front of flags, photo opportunities with pints of beer. Whereas you look at someone in Wales, you look at Mark Drakeford, who has an actual message that he's sending to the people he's supposed to be representing. He has a proper ideological stance as a trade union. He's probably a social democrat as far as that's concerned. And same thing with SNP. They have a vision of what they want. I mean, it's kind of single issue topic as regards to independence, but they also pose a reasonable opposition to Tory party hegemony as far as the UK goes in terms of policy direction. Now, it's not surprising, for example, that people would want to switch from a Labour Party that basically stands for nothing to a Conservative Party who's, we have had a good vaccine rollout, and we're actually starting to reopen now. Obviously, we'll just kind of forget the 6 figures of people who have died and focus on the good bits. But, when you are the party in power and you do have the political hegemony of the media apparatus that supports you, it's very easy for that to be a message that you can get out to people pretty easily, right? That's not surprising. Although it's also a failure, not just of Labour's lack of vision, but lack of local council policy. So you look at the places, for example, where Labour have increased their majority or done well, places like Preston, Salford, Liverpool, Bristol, all these places are places where local policy has actually had some kind of regenerative effect on these communities, which obviously has. A lot of the kind of red wall constituencies have been left behind not only by central government policy, because the Tories have been in power for so long, they could just throw money away from Labour constituencies. They just take money away from it to force them to be able to want to create political change. But even then, the local Labour governments in these areas haven't been doing the kind of policies that would engender people to want to continue to vote for, like Mark Drakeford has had over in Wales, and like people like Mark Dennett and Andy Burnham have had in Manchester, Preston, Salford, etc., etc. So if you look at Preston, the kind of local policies that they're doing that has made people excited to vote for Labour candidates are things like a cooperative fund, a credit union, all these kind of things that be able to regenerate the area without, wanting to capitulate to big corporate investment, investing in local businesses and local actions and things like that, where people have a community aspect that you don't get when you just offer big sums of money for large businesses to come into your area. So these kind of policies that create local community, local regeneration, and a transformative effect on people's genuine actual interests and livelihoods within those areas, then you're going to engender people who are going to want to keep in power. This hasn't happened in these these lost red wall constituencies where there is a large aging population, and as I went through in my last video, these are the kind of people who've benefited from low house prices. They were probably previously blue collar workers in the past, so that's why these constituencies have continued to vote Labour. But obviously, as industrialisation has changed into a more into more of the post-industrial age that we've got going at the moment, these jobs have gone away. These communities have started crumbling up from around the previous industrial industries that they were built around. It's now, especially in these constituencies where the data shows that home ownership is higher amongst Conservative voting constituencies, even though they are slightly less middle class than other places would be. I'd probably kind of reject the idea of middle class as a as a way of being able to group people. At the end of the day, you have proletariat and bourgeoisie as far as I'm concerned, but even if we look from a kind of traditional British sense of middle class, they're not quite there. But these are all people that, as I mentioned in my last video, they all gained from this increase in home ownership, and then the younger generations that aren't living in these places, because they've all moved to cities for actual job prospects since in the post-industrial kind of world that we live in, they're now not part of those communities which have been run down, both through the lack of labour investment, the lack of funding from centralised, the lack of funding from Westminster that's been centralised by the Conservative Party, and also the change in demographics and demographic shift in these areas. It's not surprising that they're turning more conservative now. Although when you look at somewhere like Hartlepool, where, as Jack points out correctly, they ran a Remain candidate. They parachuted like some fusty Remain candidate into a Leave area when we still aren't fully through the throes of like the ways in which Brexit has affected our political climate. It's absolute nonsense, and the fact that Keir Starmer's like an arch Remainer, right? He was always in favour of it, and he's not going to be able to create a movement to be able to want to vote for him in these areas when he's not against Brexit that they voted for. Doesn't give them any vision to want to vote for. Doesn't offer them any kind of movement forward to make their communities rich and prosperous again, because they've lost so much over the years. And why would they? And then obviously there's sort of like some amount of this that can be due to the fact that it being a Conservative government, they can just essentially promise in these by-elections, they can just kind of promise money for these people ad infinitum. And even the Labour candidate admitted that they didn't have anything to offer. And I'm like, well, maybe you should have a look at the kind of socialist policies that these social democratic policies, or these local regenerative policies that have been tried and tested in these more municipal areas. Maybe you would have been able to create a movement of people who would actually want to vote for you. But unfortunately, just saying we're not the Tories and we're not Jeremy Corbyn is not enough to cut it. So, where do the left go from here? Now, I know I just mentioned him, but the first thing I want to say is stop talking about Jeremy Corbyn. Just stop it. It's dead. It's gone. You can say, "Oh, Jeremy this, Jeremy that," on both sides. The right of the Labour Party can talk about long Corbyn, even though he actually won majorities in Hartlepool with over 50% of the vote. All these kind of things, right? And how it's the actual polls that said there were poor leadership was one of the main reasons why people didn't vote for Labour in Hartlepool, etc., and in local council elections too. They thought leadership was still bad. You can't just blame Corbyn forever. But what we can't do as socialists within the Labour Party, we can't just continue to cling to this Corbyn legacy, which is only toxic from an optical perspective. Like, many people don't like Jeremy Corbyn, and polls showed that too. Partially due to media misinformation. I get that. I get that a lot of this is just smear tactics from plutocrats in the media industry trying to trying to protect their vast amounts of wealth by smearing someone who might take that away from them. But he doesn't have a particularly great history and was a pretty crappy leader as well. He was really good at engaging with young people, the people whose kind of policies that he was pushing were meant to move across, right? Meant to engage them in politics. But he didn't do a good job of actually leading the party, whereas John McDonnell was actually focused on creating a movement that could actually win an election. Jeremy was very much more ideological in his outlook, and this wasn't helpful as far as winning elections is concerned. And we can't just sit there and rest on our, and to continue bringing us back to this old Corbyn would have done, etc., etc., etc. We need to find policies and a movement and, local activism that's going to be able to make people want to support our policies in the future. Now, I do think we should try and depose Starmer. I don't think he's the right man for the job. I don't think he's done a good job. And I think at this point, his reputation is probably going to be tarnished for the rest of his tenure as the Labour leader. And I don't think sticking with him is the way to go, mostly because I think he's a bit of a neoliberal shell at this point. I don't think he stands for what we stand for in general, within the Labour Party membership in general. And I don't think, as we've seen from this previous election cycle, I don't think he's going to be the person who's going to be able to bring people across who've been lost to the Conservatives now in red wall seats either. I don't think he's the worst of both worlds at this point, really. We need to think more local about the ways in which we engage with people in these constituencies. A lot of people have been talking about a cultural rift that's happened in the country. And if I have to read the word metropolitan on Twitter any more times, I think I'm going to scream. We have this, Khalid Mahmood was talking about how, wealthy, city-dwelling, liberal, metropolitan, all these kind of buzzwords about young people within inner cities who are somehow supposed to be less working class than somebody who actually owns their house in these red wall constituencies, right? Like, if we're struggling to pay the bills, we're living to paycheck, and we're having 40% of our income extracted from us in the form of rent because we're never going to be part of the property owning portion of this country. For generations, right? For decades and decades, we're going to be completely excluded from the property market. Again, as I explained in my last video, you want to go and watch that to be able to get a rough idea of what I'm talking about here. But just to be clear, what has happened over time is that property has been more and more collected within the hands of a few amount of people and an older amount of people, and first-time buyers are getting older and older as well, which means more and more young people are being excluded from home ownership due to the cuts in social housing and the continued low interest rates. That means and obviously the stamp duty holiday we just had means that more people who have current accumulated wealth are then investing that in more property, which then reduces the supply, increases the demand, price goes up, etc. You get that, which prices young people out of property ownership. So you have people who have vast amounts of asset wealth, much more than we do at our generation, who still come from, the DE economic class that we do. They're still working, they were working or are in the ends of their working career in kind of low-skilled jobs. The kind of things that a lot of millennials work in. I work in a bloody call center, right? Maybe I'm educated as a person, but it doesn't mean that's not a level of class, right? You can be educated and you can still be poor. Young people, our generation has the biggest university attendance of any generation in British history, right? More and more of us are going into education. Now, what this leads to is educational inflation. The more people who have degrees, the less your degree is worth, because it doesn't set you apart from the rest of the rest of these people as well, right? Whereas previously, very few people went to university, especially not from working class backgrounds either. These people, there was this cultural rift between the two of them. And you've got the degree, you went into these higher paid skilled jobs, and if you didn't, then you went into there was definitely skilled jobs for you to go to, like plenty of vocational tradesmanship jobs are very, very skilled and actually reasonably well paid as well. But you don't need a university education, you need an apprenticeship, etc., etc. Like, there's, going back to the point I was making, there's the education inflation thing that I'm going on, which means that despite the fact that our generation is really highly educated as far as generations go, we're all still working in the kind of DE sector. Like, how is someone who is 62 in Bolton and who owns their own, 6-figure home that was worth £20,000 when they bought it in the 70s. Like, how is this person supposed to be more of a working class person than someone who maybe got a degree but then ends up working in H&M in retail or in a coffee shop or in a call centre, who doesn't own any property at all, has basically zero assets as well? These are being labelled as the metropolitan liberal elite. I'm like, well, no, we're just working class. We just have a different life kind of trajectory, and we're talking about what's happened is people are talking about class as some kind of nebulous cultural identity, rather than a material quantitative description of the conditions that you live in and the job that you do and the work that you do and your relationship to the means of production. Now, I'm going to sound like a scary Marxist here, but that's what working class is. If you make your money from the labour that you sell to a capitalist, and you don't make money off capital gains, you don't make money off of other people's labour, you are working class. That is how that works. You don't have to wear a football shirt and a flat cap. They may be cultural trappings that are sometimes, codependent on being, or codependent, sorry, are kind of correlated with the working class background. These are just cultural trappings. These are not an actual definition of what constitutes, from a quantitative sense, being someone who is working class. What this is a long-term optical mission from the right to decouple the material reality of working class and to cloud this in the kind of cultural trappings that I mentioned before, trying to drive a electoral wedge between the city dwelling working class, or the younger working class, or the educated working class, and the older rural dwelling working class as well. Because at the end of the day, our interests, apart from with regards to our property wealth, which, as I've mentioned before, like the only way of solving the property disparity is with, building of social housing, of additional housing development to be able to increase the supply, so that the demand supply curve means the price goes down. But that's going to affect the material interests of the electoral cohort that's very large, you don't want to see their house prices drop, which is what's going to happen if you build more social housing. So it makes it basically kind of like, it makes it, very, very, it's like political poison to want to advocate for additional housing building. Like the amount of letters people in planning permission get whenever someone tries to build any amount of additional housing in any area. I've seen this firsthand plenty of times, but I'm sure it's not just anecdotal evidence on my half. I think this holds true as far as most areas of the country go. The planning permissions, it's electoral suicide to want to be at the point at which you're going to be trying to reduce people's assets that they hold at the moment by decreasing their property wealth. But regardless, the material conditions that we are in, the material interests that we as working class people have now, whether you be working as, whether you're working as a tradesman, or whether you're working in the service industry, or whether you're working in a call centre, or wherever you are, if you are selling your labour to a capitalist, our interests as working people, at the very least, are the same. And if you ignore these kind of cultural trappings that are meant to divide these, to be able to pit the municipal working class people against rural working class people, then that's an easy way of creating an electoral paradigm that, especially within first past the post, that creates division to be able to engender conservative power. And what we have to do as leftists is we have to find a way to bridge that gap and to decouple the propaganda that's been driving this wedge. Because you see a lot on the internet, people talking about, it's just the left's become too woke. It's all woke liberals sipping lattes, and I'm just like, I don't give a shit what coffee. Old people drink coffee too. Like, have you ever been to a branch of Costa Coffee? There's people of every generation in there drinking coffee. Just because we're younger and we're hip and we've grown up around a paradigm in which there are other people of different cultures that we grow up around. Just because we have this different outlook doesn't mean we're any less working class, doesn't mean we're any less part of this movement in which we need to create better conditions for working people. Like, you don't own a bunch of assets that set us apart materially from these people. Like, it's a ridiculous fallacy that is part that has been born out of conservative propaganda. We have to break that down. I think the way we do that is through, as I mentioned before, local policy, regenerative policy that shows that from a local government kind of lens, it shows that we can benefit people with these policies. We can benefit both young and old, whether they be young working class or old working class people, like working class people alike. They can still be beneficiaries of these policies. Because at the end of the day, people say, "Oh, Labour have lost the working class." Well, what does the working class need? They need high wages. They need more working benefits. They need better control over their workplace. These are all things that working people just need, right? From quantitative perspective, not qualitative, quantitative perspective, right? They need not to go through fire and rehire. Which is the party that is standing against fire and rehire? It's the Labour Party, right? Which is the one that's fighting for a higher minimum wage? It's the Labour Party. These are not conservative issues. Just because you dislike the fact that Labour have some kind of social issues they take care of as well, you cannot ignore the material importance of the actual policies that have been generally supported by Labour movements throughout history. Throughout history. And just because, screw you, I've got my house, I've got my retirement, doesn't mean that you shouldn't at least try and take some responsibility to create a better world for the person that you used to be, right? I'm not trying to, I guess I'm kind of preaching to these people here, and it's look, I understand where your material interests lie, but as someone who is working, as these old people are working class people who went through their entire lives going in these industries. Imagine if you were going through fire and rehire right now. Imagine how much that would actually affect you, and the pay cut that you'd have, and the worst working conditions and the worst benefits that you would be forced to take through corporate hegemony. And the only way of breaking corporate hegemony is with a Labour government. It's the only way of doing it. Or another political left-wing party's Labour government, but that's not happening. I don't live in a fantasy world where suddenly the Liberal Democrats or the Greens or or Tusk or whatever can suddenly win an election. At the moment, we live in a two-party system until first past the post goes, which fingers crossed it hopefully will do, which is not going to, because the Conservatives are basically trying to build power forever, as we'll talk about later, trying to fight on the grounds that the battlegrounds that have been drawn by the Conservatives about this culture war nonsense and what defines working class. We need to fight that worldview with a positive worldview of our own to be able to change the paradigm that we live in. Otherwise, if we keep fighting on the battlefields that they've drawn up, they're going to keep winning. Maybe, and also I think there's a reasonable amount of argument that we stop being so vitriolic in our social policy and our social policy advocacy, because that does piss people off, and people don't like. I don't want to call it woke stuff, because that's a really loaded phrase that pisses off a lot of people, and I think it does disservice to the social policy that we have. But just because we advocate for the rights of ethnic minorities, the rights of LGBTQ people, these social issues, doesn't mean that we also that doesn't mean that we're not also fighting for the needs of the material needs of working people as well. And that is the position that we need to get across to people. Because at the end of the day, if you look at the manifesto, especially under Corbyn and things like that, there were loads of good things for working people there. Obviously there were, but no one heard about it because we spent too much time fighting on this culture war bollocks that gets pushed by the media, it gets pushed by the Conservative Party, and it gets pushed by people who have an axe to grind. Because at the end of the day, it's not as big an issue as what's happening with regards to the public money and tax avoidance and all these crony contracts and employment laws. Post-Brexit, the Conservatives were looking at scrapping the Working Time Directive, which is clearly going to massively impact. Who is it going to impact? Of course it's going to impact working class people, right? These are all issues that we agree on, so we need to find a way in which we actually agree on these issues moving forward, rather than letting the cultural issues be driven by the people who we don't represent, the people who don't represent us, essentially. And Reese, how are you doing? You keeping well? I hope you are. Sorry, I went off on a bit of a rant there, because I just get frustrated at being told that I'm somehow part of the elite just because I happen to have gone to university, right? That's not where the elitism line is drawn anymore. elite, what an elite, like what is an elite and what is who's the establishment. It's been such a fucking muddied term at this point. It's impossible to have a reasonable conversation about it, because then it's like, oh, you're an elitist university. Oh, you're part of the establishment because you support LGBTQ people. I'm just like, corporations cynically push these issues because they think it's going to engender them more money. They don't seriously believe in these particular political movements. Like, you're the one being the idiot, taking a corporation at its word. If you seriously think that Wagamama slapping an LGBTQ flag on the front of their shopfront is in some way indicative of the political beliefs of the people in charge, rather than just some kind of cynical marketing ploy. Like, on the left, we call that rainbow capitalism, right? We dislike that. No, everyone hates that. But we need to get those messages across, because otherwise we're just going to get lost in a sea of cultural nonsense that's fucking meaningless, and all it does is just divide, the people who have a genuine class interest together. Rant over for now, I guess. And it's frustrating as well, like having a look at the internal fight between left and right in the Labour Party, because it's clear that the people, when we had like at least some kind of leftist bias in the Labour Party policy, we got more votes, we got more support, we were more active on the political scene. Whereas when we tried to do a Tory impression, remember those controls on immigration mugs that Ed Miliband tried to push, and then we did really, really badly? Like, it doesn't work anymore. Well, like, you can see, because like with the mayoral elections and things like that, there were so many things that, and these were all in kind of city areas where a lot of, working class people live. Just because they're in a city doesn't mean they're not working class. Like, these areas in which they feel more of the material interests of the difference between between the bourgeoisie and proletariat, right? And these people continue to vote for Labour as they did in Wales as well. It's I could see there's like a class divide, an age divide, and like an urban-rural divide that's happening. We need to find a way of being able to bridge the gap between those two divides, right? Does that make sense? Yes, it will definitely make an excellent segment. I'm glad. There's a really good article by Ash Sarkar, which I would highly recommend people watch or read, rather. Yeah, because that's the crazy thing. The Conservative, she makes it really, really important. Makes a really important point that like everyone is doing identity politics. The right more so than everybody. Like, the right talking about like how like class is some like cultural identity rather than a substantive set of material conditions. It's poisoning like the discourse so heavily, and it infuriates me no end. Yeah, I'm really glad we chose the bodies piled high in their thousands guy over the free broadband for everyone guy. I think that was a really good choice. Again, I'm not going to talk about Corbyn. As I said, we need to stop talking about Corbyn. We need to talk about policies. We need to talk about vision. We need to talk about regeneration. We need to talk about community. All these things that people actually agree on, rather than focusing on random politicians who happens to be a figurehead for those movements at the time, right? Corbyn's over, it's done, it's gone, forget about it. Let's move on, right? Although the broadband policy would probably have been really good when everyone was stuck at home for a year. We also need to have policy which involves the construction of new homes. We just can't make it a flagship policy because of how politically toxic it is. Well, I think that it's definitely an emerging property of social media, but I think identity politics and intersectionality are important parts of lots of different kinds of analysis. But people talk about identity politics. Well, what you actually talk about is just demographics. Like, you have this opposition to the idea that we look at things as part of generalized demographics and the way in which the needs of these people correlate, right? Like, people, like the kind of people who say, oh, if you just ignore racism, then it will go away. And I'm like, well, no, it literally won't. Like, the reason why we have to talk about racial disparity is because people who are racist made those particular distinctions in the first place. Class is a bit unique, so our culture fixating a lot of the constitutional monarchy thing. Class being a social identity makes sense, even if it's ultra-pilchard. Yeah, it's an imagined community, whereas other people, otherwise, what actually is, in layman's terms, a bunch of made-up bollocks. Because then, like, how do you even define something such a nebulous concept as Britishness? Although I do feel like we should try and find a way of talking about British identity in a more positive kind of way, right? We could create a positive, progressive patriotism where we talk about not only the way in which creating a more cohesive and communitarian society is going to be better for us as a local community, right? We can still compare ourselves to the way other countries do things and say, look, these countries are good, let's make ourselves the best country we can be. There's another segment that I did a while back about whether we on the left can retain in some amounts of patriotic thought in the way in which we talk about the policies that we enact, the policies that we advocate for. So if we talk about, say, for example, the credit unions or the cooperative fund in Preston, we say this makes Britain better if we have these things. So let's do them. Let's make the country the best it can be, rather than blindly thinking that it's the best that it is already because of cultural trappings, rather than keep saying this is the actual material existence of what living in this country is like. There's a really good video by my friends over at Confide Music for their new charity single called UNICEF Kingdom, which talks a lot about how the concept of British identity is not going to materially make anyone's lives better. So if we try and turn that around into some kind of, message that resonates with people on a material level, then maybe we can get things can be a little bit more interesting, a little bit more positive moving forward, a little more positive and progressive. And I would highly recommend you watching that video and buy the single. Proceeds going to the Trottle Trust. Little plug there for you, Confide. I hope you then also give me plugs in return. Thanks. Brilliant. Thank you. I agree on British identity. We can into the Britishness of the digger community and the radical Protestants of the 600s. Exactly. 100%. Like, we can talk about things liking and like isn't to literally bring up with the diggers. We can talk about, enclosure and the way in which it's enclosure, the way it's shaped our society in such a way that's bad, and talk about ways we can move past that. Really kicks in when it comes to complex issues, scientific like health or climate change. People just don't have the critical thinking skills to sniff out the bullshit, and schools won't teach them because, hopefully, like as I said before, we're such an educated generation. Hopefully, that will mean that as time goes on, these issues become less, and this becomes less of an issue. I was watching. I'm a patron of H1 guy. I was watching his video about vaccines, and what's interesting, even with all the disinformation about vaccines coming from the UK, the fact that it was so widely discredited by Brian Deere and places like that made Britain one of the countries with the highest percentage of people who are taking the COVID vaccine, even though the anti-intellections of the anti-vax movement came from the UK and from a study from the UK and Andrew Wakefield, it actually made us as a country more likely to take the vaccine. So I have a feeling that once we move past this cultural bollocks, things will get better. The problem is, how do we break a lot of the corporate hegemony surrounding the media that people consume and the media message that people consume? Like, it's going to get even worse with things like Newsmax and GB News. Like, I had one of my friends on Talk Radio talking about their charity they have about creating consent classes in university, and it was just infuriating them watching the people push this specific media line rather than engaging critically with what it was saying. Do you wish there were better solutions to social problems than wait 30 years? Unfortunately, as I've mentioned already, a lot of this is involved in material wealth that's just been annexed from millennial people, and unless we actually vote in people who are going to move wealth around such that it benefits us, these problems are going to persist until the boomers die off in Minecraft. And that's why community organising is important. We need to talk about mutual aid. We need to talk about local governance, things that we can do directly right now. Like the Preston stuff has only happened in the last 4 years. That's not a long time frame for us to have a look at our local governmental policy and speak to our councillors and all of the people in local government that represent us and talk about, look at these things people are doing. This is good. This gets votes and it makes the society the working class and the community better. We need to focus on a community-driven angle, because of neoliberal capitalism, we've become more atomized, become more individualized, and it's to the detriment of our society as well. Like, we need to think about the ways in which we bring people together. And if we bring people together from a community perspective, and then also talk about our socialist policies as well, we get people on board. Because what is socialism if not a kind of community-based initiative in which, we unite on the grounds of our material interests as the working class? Like, we can move people around on these particular issues. We just need to actually organise, and not just think that electoral politics is going to be the smoking gun that allows us to do it, because it's not. Like, it's a good soapbox to get our ideas passed, but constantly engaging in just talking about electoral politics is going to be a dead end for us, because it's not going to be. It doesn't on its own create a sense of unity between people that we need to be able to move our cause forward. Rethinking of social democracy, much like our first world left has been pushing work-ups to the revolution, maybe a new democratic experiment can work. Well, that's why I think, the Corbyn manifesto was good. The policies were popular. He wasn't. Like, in 2019, if we'd have had someone running on his platform who wasn't his, I think and also didn't have the stupid fucking second referendum policy, I think Labour would have done quite well. But unfortunately, we still had the Corbyn baggage was continuing, and people were kind of disillusioned with him as a leader, because the media smears had become more prevalent and more endowed in people's minds. Plus the second referendum policy, like, I don't think that we need to move away from these kind of policies. We need to think about how we talk to people on the ground. I think it's gonna be more important. I mean, we definitely have this. We definitely are in the throes of socialism or Pasockification, right? Like, it's seen around the rest of social democracies in Europe, apart from maybe like Denmark and Norway, who seem to be continuing on the social democratic platform. Thank Christ. But we can also see why it's been more beneficial for Denmark and Norway than it has for Sweden as well. So at least we've got data on our side. And I think the policies like we see in Preston are going to be important moving forward in getting people around to our way of thinking, because they bring out votes. They do bring out votes. And we also need to get young people involved in the political process. And what's going to happen? That's not going to happen if we have Keith Starmer in charge, like the fucking, bland, motionless, directionless, visionless, platitude chewing out nonsense, boring non-entity that he is. We need someone who's going to actually get people to want out to vote, and give young people an actual movement forward. Like, I was very much in favour of people voting for Nico Omilana for London Mayor, because his policies were get young people involved in the political process. Like, I don't think necessarily meant that, but he said he was going to be a voice for young people, which we don't have across the political spectrum, apart from maybe in the Green Party. Maybe an Eldon Lane with theatre training. I mean, being in the position where we can advocate in this way is going to be good, obviously, but it's tough. It's tough to think about. Which is very frustrating to see Keith move even further right in his cabinet picks. And God, fucking Rachel Reeves, why? She's so bad. I hate her so much. Why'd have to do this West Streeting as well? Blairite nonsense. Also, what's frustrating is I feel like it's my own kind of anecdotal experience, but I feel like the Iraq War and the Blair years have kind of there's so much toxicity surrounding it, and the Labour Party really needs to find a way of casting off the shackles of the Iraq War and PFIs and all that kind of malarkey, because it's really has so much kind of toxic associations with Labour, and trying to move ourselves away from that is going to be a good thing, which obviously Keith doesn't do, because no one was talking about the Iraq War and things when Jeremy Corbyn was in power. But go make a pizza. Okay, well, I'm kind of jealous. Although I had like goulash with pasta for tea, so I had excellent food this evening. So I'm not gonna complain. So, moving on to our next piece of content. That rant took me quite a long time, but it'll be very, very interesting to see. Let me have a look at what we had up next. Let me put my headphones on, because I think we're going to cover a YouTube video. I've got the right headphones selected. Let's just up the... Yeah, that's fine. So we have this Lawrence Southern video that a friend sent me called A Conservative Critique of Capitalism. And that'd be interesting, because I think we'd probably agree on quite a lot here. And then the interests we'd agree on would then immediately turn us away from each other. Like, very interesting to see. Let me just have a look. Okay. I'm just trying to get my... I want to be going into this screen. Right, okay. Lawrence Southern's Conservative Critique of Capitalism. Let's have a look at this and see what she's talking about here. As I said, I think we might agree on some of the kind of more obvious aspects of why capitalism is bad, and then come to completely different conclusions about why it's bad or the implications thereof. Let me speed up the video a little bit.
First of all, I would like to give a warm welcome to all of the people who are here for the first 10 seconds of the video to leave a dislike and an angry response calling me a communist before even watching it. And goodbye. All right, now that that's out of the way, comrades, working men and working women, collective farmers, brothers and sisters, guerrillas, we must fight for the socialist revolution. Fight to the end until the complete victory of the proletariat and the
Based.
overthrow of the international bourgeoisie. Long live the worldwide social... Seriously, people, you do not have to join the Red Army to recognize that capitalism has some problems. You can even love it and realize this. But the truth is, one could create the greatest system in the universe, but as soon as you insert humans, said system will have issues. Check out the Garden of Eden. We suck. Especially when we were given the freedom to suck. I'm not sure when exactly this Republican worship of capitalism...
yes, the old freedom is bad argument. I love that argument.
...began, but it is a problem, and it needs to stop. Capitalism is just a system of economics. It is not a god, it's not a moral system, and it's not going to save us. And in fact, in its current highly toxic form, has arguably been the downfall of both traditionalism and conservatism in many ways. And coincidentally, is the most powerful weapon currently used by radical socialist activists who seemingly have given up the class war in favor of winning the culture war hand in hand with big corporations.
I'm gonna kill myself in Minecraft and Roblox satirically if people keep talking about the idea that socialists have abandoned class politics in favour of the culture war in line with corporations. No, we hate when corporations do this. It's called rainbow capitalism. I talked about it earlier. They are doing it cynically to appeal to kind of cultural consensus that we have about these issues. Like, this is not what was happening. You are being the absolute fool here if you're taking a corporation at their word, thinking that they're completely what's the word I'm looking for? Forthright in these opinions. It's completely cynical. Like, it's just these half-assed, just like completely vapid assertions that they try and do, culturally good things. Like, they don't. That's why you see oil companies go, well, we really care about the environment, and they change actual nothing about their business practices. Like, this idea that, like, literally every Marxist and socialist on social media talks about economic issues all the time. Like, it's infuriating when they make this point. We completely just because socialists and corporations maybe might from like a very kind of shallow perspective appear to agree on social issues, even though one of them is doing it one of them is doing it obviously and one of them is doing it cynically. Like, doesn't mean that means that these are in league on everything. It's just like, does that mean all vegetarians are in league with Hitler? Like, come on, are all like anti-Nazis in league with Stalin? It's such a reductive argument. The idea that if these people agree on one issue, it means that they're in lockstep with each other and everything. It's complete nonsense. It has no basis in reality.
So let's jump right into it and go through the three main problems I have here and why. 1, the amount of power corporations have is too damn high. I have a lot in common with libertarians. I ran for the Libertarian Party. I generally want to be left alone and not have the foot of the state constantly on my throat. However, where I tend to part ways with my libertarian friends is I think there are significantly more threats to our freedoms than just the state, such as the many violent, non-government authoritarian criminals and foreign terrorist groups that exist. All people I don't particularly want entering my country or running around freely. Libertarians will often disagree with me and respond by saying, sure, Lauren, violent people exist, but they are just not as big a threat as the all-powerful state is to our freedoms. Therefore, no matter the potential benefits of the state in stopping or reducing other evils, it must be abolished or at least severely reduced, because they are the bigger problem.
I mean, it's almost like the corporate powers in the United States are the ones lobbying the government to then use the power of the state to crack down on people. Might that be the case? Also, we're going to get into like positive, negative freedoms here. So let's stay tuned.
Which, fair enough. Deal with the greatest threat to freedoms first. The only problem here, though, is that the government is no longer the 800-pound gorilla. It's more like an organ grinder's monkey dancing to corporate music. Western governments are largely controlled by
she's probably going to make the point I just made here, which is good.
Corporate lobbying pressure, campaign donations, and now even censorship of politicians we once would have thought were more powerful than said corporations. And the worst part about the corporations having this power is we didn't elect them. And no, we didn't vote for them with our dollar either. I'm sure a lot of us would much rather go to our local shops and hire our neighbors for jobs over some faceless, nameless corporation, but unfortunately it's becoming near impossible to compete with global monopolies utilizing slave labor to drive down prices while we have to adhere to reasonable local labor laws, not to mention all the government grants, tax cuts, and favoritism for big business elites. It is simply...
Then, how about stop supporting parties that continue this narrative, which is, unfortunately, in the United States, is both parties. Isn't she Canadian anyway? She could just vote for the NDP. Like, come on. Like, there's a third option here. Although when she was... let me rewind a second.
Because they are the bigger problem, which, fair enough. Deal with the greatest threat to freedoms first. The only problem here, though, is that the government is no longer the 800-pound gorilla. It's more like an organ grinder's monkey dancing to corporate music. Western governments are largely controlled by corporate lobbying pressure, campaign donations, and now even censorship of politicians we once would have thought were more powerful than said corporations. And the worst part about the corporations having this power is we didn't elect them. And no, we didn't vote for them with our dollar either. I'm sure a lot of us would much rather go to our local shops and hire our neighbors for jobs over some faceless, nameless corporation, but unfortunately it's becoming near impossible to compete with global monopolies utilizing slave labor to drive down prices while we have to adhere to reasonable local labor laws.
Well, that's a problem with a lack of regulation. Say, the state, it's the 800-pound gorilla, it's too powerful. I'm like, well, this is the natural problem with the free market economy, right? It engenders the nature of cartels, people who protecting their profits at all costs, and then, sure, some people are going to get rich by creating a product that appeals to lots of people, that has lots of market value, that increase their market share through a USP. But then again, when that, as I was talked about in the Sean video about how PragerU lies to people, in how like the situation doesn't just end at the point at which people just, are the most populous, they get all the money and that's good. It then goes up, as actually to Lauren's credit, as she says, then goes into corporate lobbying, it pushes out small businesses, but that's just the nature of the market. Unless you have antitrust laws, unless you have, regulations in place at a government level, these cartels and this paradigm that we have that creates so much corporate power, unless you regulate that's going to continue to happen.
Not to mention all the government grants, tax cuts, and favoritism for big business elites. It is simply not possible to compete, which is tragic for hardworking small businesses and medium businesses, which I, and I'm sure many of you, really support. Now, I know what you're thinking. I know what you are all thinking. Lauren, this is not real capitalism you were talking about. This is crony capitalism. And you'd be absolutely right. But here's the
wrong. All capitalism's crony capitalism. Welcome to the real world.
kicker. Real capitalism has never been tried. Just like how real communism has never been tried. Both of these theories and systems on a large scale are ahistorical constructs. We have never lived in a world where millions of people have had to share with each other the way a family does. And we have never lived in a world where everyone buys and sells from each other with no restrictions or aggression from anyone else. So if we want...
That's not what capitalism is, though. That's just a free market economy. What capitalism is an economic mode of production in which the means of production are owned by private entities, and which people work and they sell their labour to these people. It is a mode of production that involves the private ownership of the means of production. That's what it is. It is real capitalism. That's what we have right now. Like, all market systems are subject to external forces, right? They all are. And just because in this particular case the external forces are the power that the corporate monopoly and corporate hegemony has over the market, is just another aspect of having the private ownership of the means of production. And this particular mode of production is completely nonsensical to just say, well, this isn't real capitalism. In the same way that it's stupid to say that, the ways in which Gosplan were planning economies within the Soviet Union, say that wasn't real communism. You just say this is bad communism or bad capitalism because it's at its heart. I guess technically, if you go by the actual definition of communism, the moneyless, classless, stateless society, and obviously the Soviet Union was not. But at the end of the day, academic definitions of these terms aren't really the terms that have the social utility that people understand. And as far as we know, the closest state has ever been to communism is the Soviet Union. So this can be people's points of reference.
Want to deal with reality, what we have to examine is how capitalism has actually worked in history. And to my libertarians, a little side note, if you need to mentally put the word crony in front of capitalism for the rest of this talk to get through it, that's perfectly fine. Like I said, you're not wrong, but I'm speaking to the system in place.
Yes, they are wrong. It is capitalism. Like, they talk about the things, this particular thing that people on the internet have, where they try and conflate the idea of markets and capitalism, is infuriating to me. Because I'm pretty sure a lot of the people in my followers have, because I know lots of people from watching people like Forsch and Perspective Philosophy and Lonerbox and people like that. We are probably more knowledgeable about market socialism and the idea of cooperative ownership of the means of production within a market economy. You look at Yugoslavia and places like that, where this has been tried and been not successful, but it wasn't bad. It's like it wasn't the levels of, abject poverty that we saw during the Soviet Union, like Yugoslavia, places like that. Like there was a market economy, but there were still people buying and selling, people freely trading, but there was not private ownership of the means of production. Right? That is the distinguishing factor between socialism and capitalism.
Today that Republicans often defend as capitalism. And history tells us that this system can absolutely lead to brutal, authoritarian, and freedom-threatening results, as it is quickly doing so today. Corporations have the power to politically manipulate populations, to deny us our speech, and even to control our thoughts and feelings through algorithms. That is terrifying. And despite this, you still have Republicans out here defending it as just a private company. And another peep you may hear from them in defense of our corporate overlords is, well, at least they can't throw you in jail. At least they won't put you against a firing wall or start wars. Yeah, sorry, that just doesn't quite...
They can't put you in prison themselves, but they certainly profit off the prison industrial complex, so they engender a society which gets more people in prison. Like, come on. Again, I think I agree with her idea that the marriage of corporations and lobbying governments to be able to pass policies that are favorable for them is a bad thing. This is definitely somewhere that we agree. But it's just like, that's an indictment of the private ownership of the means of production, which is what the mode of production of capitalism is. Like, that's just what you're going to get if you have these kind of unregulated markets and unregulated systems.
Line up with history either. I could do a whole video on private war profiteering. And massive companies and corporations like the Dutch East India Company not only kept and sold slaves, but had private militaries larger than entire countries' militaries, and eventually became so powerful they could invade and become the acting government in areas in which they had business interests. To pretend that if we just abolished the government, none of these corporations would ever even think to oppress us, to fill that power vacuum and take away our liberties, is madness.
True.
In fact, there is already legislation being proposed to allow Nevada tech companies to form their own governments in cities. So people, if you are skeptical of and you don't like big government, you really should be just as worried about big corporations, because they don't want to uphold systems which made them wealthy, as those very systems may allow for their replacement and failure. And thus, they want to become your government and eliminate competition and question. And I fear...
That's actually very true, which is interesting. It stems to a Richard Wolff segment that I posted on TikTok a couple of weeks ago, talking about how, because the massive corporations, having brought a load of individual entities under one roof, have the ability to plan their economic inputs and outputs in similar to the ways in which you saw in economic planning models amongst communist countries, right? Because they don't want the volatility of having to deal with market forces, because it's uncertain. They want to be able to control inputs and outputs as they go within massive breadth of the market that these people dominate, right? Like, how many different chocolate bars are made by different companies who are owned by the corporation Kraft, like, across the world, right? that's a competition within a single corporation. So obviously, once you have this much of control of a part of the economy, you can start doing economic planning. And as Wolf points out, very similar to the way in which they planned the economy in the Soviet Union as well.
That these mega corporations are getting very close to that. So instead of daddy government on our throats, we'll just have, I don't know, Google soldiers TM putting us up against firing walls for illegally downloading Gab or Parler to their devices and sharing our Netflix account with more than 10 friends. But let's move on, because this second one is a far more important point, and that is capitalism's destruction of community and culture.
True, absolutely true. Again, I'm sure we're going to come to completely different conclusions from this particular criticism that she has. But I think that in general, the way in which the atomization that comes from neoliberal capitalism is a really bad thing.
I often see many on the right lamenting the loss of old traditional architecture, community, family, and art, and yet at the same time proposing capitalism as a solution. It's not even a little bit. Capitalism has no incentive to preserve our culture or communities, and in fact, I'd argue has negatively impacted families. I think where this confusion comes in is some people observe that Marxism works in opposition to capitalism and to deconstruct the nuclear family, and assume, therefore, capitalism must be working to oppose Marxism and to support the family. But capitalism is...
Marxism doesn't seek to destruct the nuclear family. That's just part of the cultural Marxist conspiracy theory that is just an anti-Semitic nonsense perpetuated by idiots, right? That's not what Marxism is. Marxism is just a critique of the capitalist mode of production and that economic system. It's an economic philosophy. Like, it's nothing to do with breaking up the family. That's just nonsense.
Is not Marxism's counter. It came about before Marxism and is therefore indifferent to it. It's simply an alternate system. And while that system can certainly bolster some people's family lives and wealth and material goods, capitalism only moderates for the markets and not for the souls and well-being of its workers. There is a reason defenders of capitalism talk about how people can't eat in communist societies, because capitalism is really, really good at creating surpluses of goods for physical needs. But does it serve, I don't know, your safety needs? Not really. Your financial security can be wiped away any minute by the stock market.
But even then, it doesn't actually generate a lot of surplus of, basic commodities that we need to live and survive, right? What it actually does is the capital interests of these people annexes these away from people and holds them hostage with the need for capital and wealth of their own. It does the complete opposite. It's completely inefficient in its distribution of the actual material needs of people that actually live and survive within a country. Like I'm going to quote Richard Wolff again because he is my favourite person. Like, I don't want the rich people to decide to buy up all of the milk to feed their pets. I want that milk to be able to feed actual children who live in our society, right? Come on. It's the capital markets necessitate the annexation of resources. That's literally the opposite of what it does.
Does it serve needs relating to love and belonging? No. Because having a wife or a husband, and definitely kids, is a drain on your productivity and resources. And anyway, in this culture, apparently it's irrational to limit yourself to just one person. Might as well just use Tinder and count yourself lucky to live in a free society, you prude. Does it serve needs related to esteem? Does anyone...
Actually, going back there one sec, I'm going to talk about the way in which neoliberal capitalism has destroyed the idea of a family unit. Now, first of all, I think that the idea of having a family unit is a good one. As a culture, having ways in which we raise children in which they have as many voices around them that are going to be able to teach them new things, give them perspectives on life, in being able to have security in the household, to be able to feed and clothe them and support them through their upbringing. I think that's a good thing. Does it have to be one man, one woman, 2 kids, a dog, and a picket fence? Absolutely fucking not. It can be 3 people. It can be 3 different generations, like it is in different countries that are substantially non-Western, like in places where, for example, in Cuba, where people actually live amongst extended families and things like that. Like, that's the norm over there. That's what they would call a family. The idea of a specific nuclear family of people who've moved out from their parents with 2 kids and a dog and a picket fence, that's a particularly recent invention, right? Now, I would actually agree quite a lot with Lauren here in that neoliberal capitalism breaks this up, because at the end of the day, its main issue is creating economic productivity. And if you have a set of the nuclear family that she purports to be massively in favour of, even though I'm not, if you have a man, for example, going to work and a woman staying home feeding their kids, that's a whole adult who is being economically inactive as far as production is concerned. So this is economic inefficiency that neoliberal capitalism just wants to completely do away with. So the idea of the family, capitalism has destroyed the notion of the family by forcing both parents to have to go to work, because not only that's how capitalism engenders society, because it requires more economic productivity, but also wages haven't grown with productivity either. And so trying to support a family on a single income, especially as a member of the working class, is basically impossible now. Both parents have to work, and, who pays for childcare? That's why social democratic countries, where are still at the mercy of capital markets, they at least have some amount of government subsidised childcare to be able to at least let these families work in an efficient manner, rather than the moment what we have in the neoliberal countries, where this just breaks apart family units completely and it tears people apart, which is bad. Like, I just don't think that her prescription that the nuclear family is the best way of raising children, I don't think that really holds true, and it definitely doesn't when you look at the ways in which you look at studies involving gay adoptive parents, who actually have shown to have children who grow up to be just as well adjusted and just as well off as children raised by biological straight parents, or even straight parents who do adopt them as well.
Does it serve needs related to esteem? Does anyone feel esteemed in an assembly line or in a job where their boss treats them like they should be grateful the company has room in the budget for free coffee? Does it serve needs relating to self-actualization?
She's sounding awfully socialist here about people who are, like, if she started talking about the means of production here, well, we could be getting pretty socialist about the difference, the worker and the worker owner or employee employer dichotomy, that authoritarian relationship that we have in our workplace with the person who decides what we do with our labour time, who takes our labour value. Josh, she's talking about this is a conservative critique of capitalism. So it's an interesting video for her to be talking about. You guess my chat is in the way of the title of this video, but yeah, and also she talks about does capitalism deal with self-esteem? And I'm like, well, in actual fact, conservative does the opposite. It specifically wants to make people feel worse about themselves because it can offer a solution. All you have to give them to that solution is your money. You look at advertising in the way that it makes it the aspirational idea of advertising, that especially came out in the late 80s, early 90s, as continued to this day, is it's trying to teach people that you maybe you are unhappy, but if you buy our product, we will make you happy, we'll make you successful, we'll make you affluent, we'll give you friends, a relationship. All that kind of stuff is being told to us by advertising. This is what we should strive for. And if we don't have access to those, then we're not cool, we're not part of the in crowd, right? This is a specific nature of the way in which advertising works in capitalism, which deliberately makes ourselves feel worse about ourselves to want to sell us products. And I think we can go further and just say it doesn't have whereas what Lauren is saying, that it doesn't have the natural ability to want to make our self-esteem better, whereas I'm saying it deliberately tries to make us feel worse to sell us products, which is a more kind of staunch critique of capitalism than hers is.
I don't know, you try self-actualizing in a gig economy, or in a world where you can lose your job the instant you self-actualize in a way that Twitter doesn't like. Also, on a side note, Marxism may have told women that being wives and mothers was shameful, but it was capitalism that broadcast that message.
Marxism hasn't told women anything. What? Again, this is all just cultural Marxism conspiracy theory baiting. Anytime she talks about any kind of cultural ideas that Marxism taught people, she's just talking bollocks.
So that all those women would enter the workforce and drive down the wages of their husbands and sons. Seriously, can we really say that it's all just government systems that have ruined our happiness? Or perhaps could some of us admit our work life, addiction to media, obsession with pursuing the next shiny product, the constant demands that we buy things to look a certain way, feel a certain way, watch this, buy that, play that, drink this, eat that? Could it perhaps be this mass consumerism and work-life imbalance that has also ripped us from our family, community, and loved ones, and
very similar to the points I was making earlier. They don't necessarily disagree.
Ourselves, in many ways as well. What Hannah Arendt called the vita activa, a state where we must always be busy, never present, and always consuming. It's just soul-destroying. And even if we move on to other factors leading to cultural decay, such as mass immigration with no assimilation, that too has largely been pushed and supported by corporations looking for cheap labor. As for old architecture, the utility of a building being nice relative to its price just doesn't add up. And don't tell me there's not a demand for beautiful buildings when people are flying halfway across the world just to take pictures with them. The problem is that the demand clearly doesn't lead to enough profit. Visual joy of the citizenry in daily life is not a business. This isn't...
no disagreements here. I think that, the idea that capital shapes life in a way that only does for profit and doesn't do for some kind of more kind of holistic view of the world, right? I think that's not something I would ever disagree with. Although I do obviously her comments here when she was talking about women joining the workforce is specifically to depress their husbands and their sons. I'm just like, okay, right. We can also live in a feminist society in which half of the people are taken out of the workforce under a socialist kind of society where we work based on need rather than profit. And just, you don't have to say that men do all the work and women don't do all the work. That's a conservative prescription that you have, rather than, some kind of moral correctness. Again, she has a moral absolutist view. I'm pretty sure that's her kind of view on masculinity and femininity, that they are two discrete things that are innate to men and women and that we shouldn't kind of play with from a kind of conservative, gender role kind of act. 'Cause I'm thinking, fine, we can take half the workforce out to raise children, but that half doesn't have to be all the women, right? Like, come on.
In large part, why the left have won the culture war. They didn't care that their arts degrees weren't particularly profitable, they just wanted to create art. And sure, I'm conceding ground to progressives in some regard, but I'm also not going to sit here and pretend that you can eat an art degree or that it was the arts that doubled our average lifespan. That was absolutely innovation pushed by commercial interests and capitalism. But
you can't just say that only capitalism is the driver of innovation. Like, who put the first people in space? It was the Soviets. Like, I know that's just like one single example, but you can also see plenty of other things that innovated through government policy or through genuine people just wanting to explore. Like, all people who studied science previously were already members of the aristocracy, all members of the bourgeois, who just did it for the fun of it, who just enjoyed study. You look at someone like Gregor Mendel, who was just a monk. He had no capital interest in, being the father of genetics. He just did it because it was something he was interested in. That's where the innovation came from. I don't think most people who end up studying the sciences and become people who make groundbreaking innovations like this, I don't think many of them do so because of the profit motive, right? What the profit motive does is it means that we don't drive things forward in a kind of community-driven sense for a better humanity. When it's entirely driven by profit, we have planned obsolescence. We have iPad. Remember the first iPad didn't have a bloody camera in it, despite the fact the technology was readily available, because next time round they'll have a camera and it gives you a reason to buy the extra product. Why do you think washing machines fail after 7 years? Because we can't make a product that's going to last the whole lifespan, because that decreases our profits. We'll put in some level of lifespan into it so that you have to buy a new one later on. That's why Apple slowed down their iPhones. All this kind of planned obsolescence is part of a profit motive that stifles innovation rather than stimulates it. And sure, maybe someone who gets an art degree isn't going to be able to feed themselves specifically with an art degree a lot of the time. In a socialist society, lots of people are going to have to work jobs they don't want to do, but they're not going to have to do it specifically to survive, and they're not going to have to do it for 40 hours of their week every single week to ad infinitum, right? Like, when we have in the post-scarcity society that we live in this kind of society that we live in, we can move forward by having people's needs met on a efficient level without resulting to the amount of kind of sinecures and nonsense bullshit jobs, if you read David Graeber, that we have at the moment, that genuinely hold no kind of societal benefit at all as far as we're concerned as people or as a culture or as a community, but only exist with regards to the wheels turn, the fact that makes the wheels of capital turn, which, as we've discussed throughout this video, isn't always in the best interests of people and society in general.
The question still arises, what is the point of a long lifespan if increasingly people aren't wanting to live said life? Ultimately, we cannot understate how consumerism makes surviving insultingly easy, but we must also acknowledge it makes living insultingly hard. Now, the last one here, number 3. Capitalism is indifferent to morality. Capitalism is not a conservative view of the world. It's not a political view at all, really. It's simply a tool which sways towards the highest bidder. If you live in a culture that is deeply sickened, the products that are both created and sold will sicken with it. They won't save it. They won't pull you out of your moral darkness. Capitalism just amplifies what we as humans desire in our hearts, which is why it has done very wonderful things, worthy of praise. But if you are a nation that has lost morality, if you are a nation that has lost God, capitalism just becomes the devil's playground.
Right, now we're really moving to the part which I'm definitely going to disagree with here. I do not believe in any kind of God, so there's going to be, we're going to have some major disagreements here.
Go ahead, ignore your family and friends so you can work to fund your alcoholism, I don't know, spend all night feeding your porn addiction and buying your way past a girl's modesty, pay for followers to feed your narcissism, why don't you? And go ahead, consume the cheapest product provided by men and women only held to their desks by the factory suicide nets, preventing them from jumping to their own death.
Well, I'm glad she understands that that's how capital production can end up working when it drives people into this man of misery through the need for capital generation. I'm glad that she recognises this, but the idea that capitalism is selling us the immodesty of women is hilarious. I mean, the idea of sex work is a whole other topic that I could spend a very, very long time talking about. But at the end of the day, right, sure, people are going to make a living somehow. And if I don't think it's any kind of aspect of moral decline on a society if people want to pay to see other people naked, right? Like, I don't place any moral value on chastity or anything like that. I mean, chastity's hot, but not the way you think it is. In Minecraft on Twitch.
But there is a reason that even the most stringent conservatives like Sir Roger Scruton often describe themselves as reluctant capitalists. Because modern capitalism is a deeply sick system, and progressives are not wrong to call that out. If you can't acknowledge where your opponents are correct, you cannot argue with them on where they are wrong. You can't even begin to explain to them that this is crony capitalism. You can't even begin to argue that it's a user issue and application rather than the system itself, without acknowledging that there is an issue in the first place. Truth is not found in political absolutes. It's not found in platitudes either. As one of my most respected mentors and Professor Ron Dart always reminds me, truth is often found in the tension. That is to say, not absolutes, nor even the center, but constantly...
Tension? Found in the tension? That sounds a little bit like Hegelian dialectics. So surely no Marxism here at all, Lauren.
Questioning and challenging ourselves and our beliefs. And as I mentioned at the start of this video, some of you may be itching to call me a socialist for publishing this, but consider that you're watching this video on YouTube. Literally any minute, with no warning, YouTube could alter its terms of service to include a provision that lets them ban this video, and then do it. How does this make them any better than countries who censor political dissidents? My banning from the UK cut me off from speaking face-to-face with 68 million people, potentially, and even if I had a primetime slot at the BBC and attracted the entire viewership of the UK, I still wouldn't get a fraction of the influence and reach that's available on YouTube. YouTube gets 8.6 billion monthly visits worldwide, literally more engagement than there are people on planet Earth. Their daily views are in the billions, and YouTube can cut you off from that audience anytime it likes, for any reason, with no warning or explanation. And because of the power of its lobbying, there's currently no chance to fix that problem. And if you complain about that massive, unaccountable, super governmental power over worldwide speech, you get accused of supporting literal centralized planning of all resources in society by some Republicans, as if there is no middle ground between, hey, I think corporations have gone a bit far, and submitting yourself to Big Brother, which is why I say...
Although, to be fair, on the terms of service argument, I'm just like, well, I understand that I think the power in which corporations have over the way in which we consume media is absolutely terrifying, and the way in which algorithms drive our ideologies, like the way it shapes our viewpoints of the world and cultivates this echo chambers, and the way it cultivates people into poor thought processes and lack of critical thinking and being able to critically analyse data that they've been given, right? I understand this is bad, but terms of service do exist for at least some amounts of reason, right? If you want to have a forum for any kind of content, there's going to have to be some amount of rules that are going to govern how you can view that content. I'm sure Lauren is very much in favour of terms of service on YouTube banning you from putting pornography on YouTube because she thinks it's morally bad that pornography exists, right? I mean, I also would agree that it would be bad if a very young child went onto YouTube and was very easily able to find porn. Unfortunately, they can find it elsewhere, but that's a topic for another day. However, it also means that if YouTube think that you are going to be promoting, I don't know, Nazism or fascism or some kind of, moral philosophy that is very well established to be repugnant, it's going to take you off their platform. And I don't think it's necessarily a problem with big tech censorship that happens. Like, you can't post My Little Pony stuff on 4chan. Is that political censorship? I mean, I guess only if you're happy for me to be the last bastion of protection for the bronies. Like, at the end of the day, part of the functionality of that forum is not having idiots posting their brony shit 100,000 times a day. In the same way that you don't want to be the content platform that allows the propagation of Nazism. Haha, too late, it's already happened, whatever. But like, even so, it still has its reputation. It doesn't want to be able to. I don't think the TOS is bad because maybe they'll take you off the platform eventually, is as that much of a smackdown argument as she thinks it is. I do agree that there is some level of scrutiny that we need to have on these corporations who have this much power of what we can and can't see. I think that is a reasonable and cogent critique. But just saying that companies have TOS that they can change is bad it's reductive.
Say this to any in my audience currently itching to call me a socialist. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. Now,
I mean, true. They all think it's socialism was when the government does stuff, when it's a public, worker-controlled means of production, distribution, and exchange. But even so, like, I don't think she truly understands the ins and outs of what socialism means either. So, pot kettle, etc., etc. Anyway, I think I've outlined in my comments and critique of this video why I think that the problems that she causes with capital are innate to the mode of production that capitalism produces, and I think socialism would be at least a step towards a solution, at least away from the kind of culture aspects that will need a more kind of reshaping of society, although hopefully in my kind of viewpoint rather than hers.
Do I have a solution for this? Great question. No, I got nothing. Sorry, guys. But to be fair, this is probably why we've let things get so whack. Because all of our solutions to these problems with capitalism throughout history have created much bigger problems for us than the initial one we were trying to solve, including the death and torment of millions. So I guess I can see why
Yes, death of tormented millions. That definitely didn't happen under capitalism at all. No, definitely loads of people dying of starvation and poverty because their access to food, water, and nourishment was put through a paywall that's necessary to have the profit motive. I wonder, Lauren. I absolutely wonder whether that might be a problem that exists across many different political societies, not just if we try and fix capitalism, people will die, which is a stupid argument.
People are a bit hesitant to brainstorm on this one, but I would rather honestly speak about the flaws in capitalism with my head held high than pretend it's perfect by burying my head in the sand, I guess. And we can't really ignore these problems forever, as the more we pretend they don't exist, the more people will turn to radical solutions rather than reasonable healing. But yeah, I just wanted to start a conversation there, and I'm glad I got that off my chest, comrades. And for those of you who really disagreed with me and stuck around to the end of this video, really respect that and appreciate that. And to those of you who enjoyed all of this video and agree with me, please consider liking and sharing it and checking out my subscribe star in the link below. Anyways, thank you again for watching this video, and I will see you all next time.
I'm not going to let her advertise to you. But anyway, there were some parts of that were definitely agreed with and were argued correctly. Like, she just put all of the different bits and pieces together about why capitalism creates poor societal cohesion through capital markets and the profit motive, all that kind of stuff. And then when she got to the bit, she said, I'm not going to try and propose a solution. And I don't like the government having too much power. Well, tough. To be able to fight these corporations, you're going to have to elect people who are happy to fight them. And unfortunately, that's not going to happen when you have two parties who are entirely beholden to corporate interests, right? It's only when you have actual politicians like Bernie Sanders who are happy to stand up to them that you're going to get the change that you want to see, Laura. And unfortunately, it's going to have to come from government power. They're going to have to clamp down on they have to clamp down on the free market, and they have to introduce market regulations that are going to help they're going to stop the overreach of these corporations, and it's not going to happen unless you actually advocate for politicians who are going to be happy to wield that power, against these big corporate entities. It's just how it's going to have to be. Although, again, happy that she at least agreed with some of those points. Happy that we agreed on at least some of those points there, which is nice to see someone on the right actually admitting that there are definitely lots of problems with capitalism. How we talk about the solutions, that is the important part. Get nihilist and apathetic when you're hungry. Have Snickers. Oh, my fan is in the way. Oh, my very squeaky chair. Anyway, did anyone else have any thoughts about that video? Again, I kind of rushed through it pretty quickly, but it's so frustrating to watch someone just put all the pieces together and then just not put them into the right shape, right? It's very frustrating. I mean, it doesn't have to be socialism fixing these problems. Even the social democratic policies of Nordic countries would solve a lot of the issues that she's seeing. And there's a lot of happiness and societal cohesion within Nordic social democratic countries that are, symptomatic of the things that she dislikes by government power. It sounds to me like she was just advocating return to monkey eventually. That was the substantive answer that you could kind of glean from that conversation. One was in the comments. But the comments are mostly just people with the same thing going, oh, there's loads of issues, but socialism is bad, so we can't do that. And I'm like, okay, I don't see anyone else advocating any better solutions. Well, that said, like, even social democracy would be... I think, as socialists, we kind of feel like social democracy is kind of toxic, as we feel like it would placate and recuperate anti-capitalist sentiment. But again, as a moral consequentialist, I think I'm happy for there to just be a situation in which we make the world better, even if we don't achieve socialism. Because it's I'm not. I guess I'm just like a revisionist radlib. Sorry. And also, as if you like check out Hunter Avalone, which is very interesting, these are lots of videos about conservative censorship, which actually turns out, if you look at the actual empirical data, conservatives aren't censored by the social media companies. And I mean, if you look at Facebook, the most watched videos are just Ben Shapiro, Fox News, Stephen Crowder, Dan Bongino's, Ben Shapiro, and then like Rachel Maddow in 10th. Like, it's all just like right-wing media have this massive monopoly over the social space, right? It just happens, right, that if your particular political movement contains a lot of racism or, advocation for policies that aren't not that far removed away from the kind of policies that were enacted by some pretty unfavourable governments in history, then, people might not want your content on their platform. Just teaching impartial economic history would be a start. True. Or like impartial history, right? Like the amount of, like, they always say history is written by the victors, but even then, like, the amount of history of the UK that we just don't learn. Like, so for example, like all the colonization stuff, obviously we learn about how the slave trade was bad, but we don't get taught about the ways in which the slave trade was fought against. We don't learn about the Haitian Revolution. We don't talk about our incursions in Africa. We don't know about the Boer War, things like that. All that kind of stuff we just don't get taught. And it's very easy to have a very kind of blinkered view of history if all you get is this one-sided Admiral Nelson, Churchill, William Wilberforce style blinkered view of history, which doesn't have the full picture. Like, like so many things that I just never knew about. Like, exactly. Like Victor Hugo, all that kind of stuff. Like, it's frustrating to have to rely on an educational system that does not have a egalitarian view of the way in which we view historical analysis. It's very, very difficult. But, it's a teething issue, and I think things are getting better. But unfortunately, people of the previous generation have spent so long with this very one-sided view of history that they think that we are indoctrinating kids into a reality that doesn't exist by teaching them more things, which is infuriating to me. Like, we're teaching people to hate Britain. No, we're teaching people to be critical of Britain. That's good. Being self-critical is a good thing. I think lots of conservatives would agree with this position that being self-critical is good because it makes you a better person on an individual level. Why can we not do that on a societal or national basis? Why cannot be intra-critical of an entire movement or society or class or etc., etc.? Like, everything isn't just individual problems. There are, unfortunately, we do live in a society. As much as I hate to admit that we do, there are demographics and all these kind of things that have, statistical points of view that are shared amongst the vast majority of these demographics, and ignoring that in favour of a ritually individualistic view serves to not paint the whole picture of what's going on. What's that feeling on removing statues? Well, I hate the idea of removing statues because if they hadn't have taken down all the statues of Hitler, that's like, then people would know who Hitler was. Like, I just don't know who he is because all the statues have gone. I have no idea of any of the history of World War II. Now there are no statues. I mean, it's more nuanced than that. I think there's a historical relevance to statues, so them being moved to museums is a good thing as well. But at the end of the day, statues exist for veneration, right? We venerate historical figures using statues. No one would make a cast iron, effigy of some historical figure unless there was some kind of veneration reason to do so, right? I mean, you look at all of the statues, the Robert E. Lee kind of era statues in the United States, those are all cheap, quickly made statues that were put up to convey a political message about post abolition in America in the South, right? It was supposed to be, I know you're not the slaves anymore, but we're still better than you, using these statues as a kind of cultural signifier, right? Like, it's, our statues effective education. Actually, like, obviously I was being really kind of facetious earlier, but I don't think so. Like they are a cultural idol, like, in some sort of a sense, the people kind of they engage around. So I don't really care that much about statues in general. Do I think Lauren is grifting? Criticizing capital still shitting on social and pretty fashion, not just conservative. I mean, Lauren Southern previously has been very fascistic in her rhetoric. She said when she took her big break and came back, she said she wasn't being as fascist as she was. She said she didn't want to have that misnomer. And I think she is kind of grifting. Like, she did, like, it was getting to the point at which being an outspoken white nationalist wasn't good PR. And once, people who came onto the scene critiquing them in the anti-SJW days of 2016, 2017, 2018, it became less profitable to be an out-and-out white nationalist, and it became better to be known as members of the IDW, people like Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, or Sam Harris, all these kind of culturally conservative people who hang around with the kind of people who used to be members of the alt-right, or etc., but they aren't as overt in their support of it in the same way that Lauren Southern was, and in which people like Nick Fuentes and Rick Fuentes is now, and Richard Spencer was previously as well. Obviously, Richard Spencer's platform has kind of died a bit, because in general you've seen that these outspoken white nationalist types are having less prominence. So I think she's trying to reinvent herself, but we all know as Marxists it's either socialism or fascism is the only place you can go after capitalism. If she feels like a kind of cultural control over a national identity from the government is the way in which we deal with the cultural decay that is indicative of capitalism, if she thinks that's the only way to go, well, that's just a very fascist outlook on the world, right? But she didn't actually advocate that in that video. That is just speculation. I would like to point that out. I'm not making any prescriptive statements about what I think Lauren Southern is. I just think that this is a possibility that this might be what she's actually groping for here. Like, it's tough. But I do think she is deliberately trying to make herself seem more centrist than she really is, by being a little bit more kind of dog whistly rather than out and out white nationalist like she was previously. Like, she wrote a book that she debated Xander Hall on, and Xander did a fucking shit job because he's an idiot. Sorry, Xander, if you're watching this, you're lovely and I'm a nice person, but you're not very good at debates, not very good at rhetoric. Please leave it to everybody else. But she took him to town. She's got this children's book about moral values, and it's like an ABC of morality. It's like F is for femininity and M is for masculinity. I'm like, these aren't moral concepts. These are just, social descriptors of behavior that we socially ascribe to the different genders, right? They don't have any intrinsic moral kind of character associated with them, unless you are very religious and believe that they do because of some kind of divine providence. Whereas when you actually think about it critically, all they are just descriptors of the way in which we ascribe activities or presentation or ways of acting to two genders, right? That's all they are. There's no moral element to the existence of femininity and masculinity. So clearly her cultural conservatism is still very strong when you look at things like her book. But, if she's not being as out and out alt-righty as she was before, that's probably better than not. But I think there's an element of grift there certainly as well. I don't think she's necessarily being in. I think she is hiding her power for at least somewhat with these kind of videos. Because, as you rightly point out, Confide, where do we go from capitalism other than fascism or socialism? Answer on a postcard. Right, we had a couple of other things that we were looking at. Oh yes, we have voter ID laws that are coming in soon. So, as of today, it's been announced, I think it was leaked in The Guardian, the government are looking at introducing voter ID in general elections moving forward, as well as another electoral change in which they're changing the way in which we elect mayors from a first and second preference alternative vote to being first past the post like the electoral system is. Both of these are flagrant attempts at manipulating the electoral system in their favour, because the first place, second place preference things, when there are multiple left-wing alternatives and only a single unified right-wing perspective, makes it less likely, if there's an alternative vote, for the Conservatives to win, because it effectively conglomerates the left-wing contingent, or at least left of the Conservatives at the very least, that left-wing contingent into one vote, rather than into the individual votes that be under first past the post. So this is a very cynical attempt at making mayoral elections more in their favour. Now, there's not really much to say about this. It's just changing the electoral system to make it more favourable. I think it's a kind of less democratic, but it is what it is. Did your comment get modded? I have no idea. Sorry, I didn't see that. I mean, I've got an auto mod on my Twitch, so I'm not sure. Try posting on Facebook instead. But yeah, anyway, going back to where I was, obviously the mayoral candidate, that's just changing the voting system, making it more preferable to them. Like, there is no intrinsic moral perspective about whether we think the first past the post or alternative vote is more democratic. They're just different voting systems. So obviously it is cynical. They're trying to just make it better for their side in this particular issue, but you can't like morally grandstand on them being snide or being anti-democratic, because they're technically not being in this case. It's just a little bit cynical. However, voter ID is fundamentally anti-democratic, because all it is doing is removing the chance to engage in democracy, which is a fundamental right in any democratic society, for you to be able to have your one person, one vote to democratically elect your representatives. Putting up an artificial barrier in front of that that doesn't actually need to exist is voter suppression and is anti-democratic. Let's explain what we mean by these terms. So obviously, as mentioned with anti-democratic, it means that putting a barrier up between someone being able to exercise their inalienable right to participate in the voting system is very clearly anti-democratic, right? But then you say, well, everyone has a photo ID, and like, wrong, 9 million people in the UK don't have, 9 million adults and members of the electorate do not have photo ID at the moment. ID is expensive. It creates a financial barrier between you and being able to vote. Okay, so it's very, very frustrating to see this obviously cynical way of affecting the voting system to be able to make it more preferable for them, because who tends to vote for the Conservative more often? It's rich people. Who tends to vote for left-wing parties? It's poor people. It's clearly shown throughout demographics. No matter how many times people tell you that, oh, working class people are now Conservative now, wrong. All the statistics show that if you are poorer, you are more likely to vote Labour. The areas in which are more deprived are more Labour voting than they are Conservative. That's just a statistical fact. That's just how it works. Maybe, at the last election, more working class people voted Conservative than Labour. That is true. But every single class strata in the UK all voted for Conservative more than Labour, so that's not the point that you think it is. The gap between the two, Conservative and Labour, was bigger amongst rich people than it was amongst poor people. And what's the group of poor people that are most likely to not already have photo ID? It's racial minorities. Who do racial minorities vote for? It's the Labour Party. Who could be confused by what they're trying to do here? As I said, it's a very cynical attempt in which to create a barrier for voting for people who are unlikely to vote for them. Then you say, well, no, you're just being scaremongering against a perfectly rational policy to make elections more fair, more representative, and less rife for corruption. There were people who were arrested for voter fraud in the 2019 election. That is true. How many people were convicted of voter fraud in the 2019 election? One. One person got convicted of voter fraud in the last election. One whole person. Is that, from a consequentialist perspective, is that enough to warrant disenfranchising the vote of 9 million people who currently don't have ID, or the however many million are going to not have ID if this changes and force them to get them, or these people are going to be forced to shell out their own money for a piece of paper that they wouldn't otherwise use other than to exercise their democratic right to be able to vote in an election, right? This is not democratic in the slightest. There is no evidence of any kind of widespread voter fraud. The 2019 election was one of the most one of the safest and most least corrupt elections we've ever had as regards to the voting populace engaging in that particular prospect. Like, the amount of voter fraud was super, super low in our elections. And to be fair, the vast majority of the time, they always have been. Like, if you are on the list and you have to register to vote with your address, etc., and that gets checked on a checkbox, all that kind of stuff as part of the voter registration process, this is just enough. Like, it creates a system in which people can't vote more than once. Like, that's just how the system works. The voter ID is completely nonsensical. It doesn't need to exist to be able to stop this thing happening, because it already does not happen. It's just a cynical attempt at being able to disenfranchise a group of voters that do not vote Conservative. It's part of their long-term political plan to be able to cement themselves in power forever, because that's all they care about, is power. They care about power and shifting money away from working people and into the hands of the people who donate their money to be in power. It's this self-repeating cycle that continues in perpetuity. It's why all the media are so fond of the Conservatives, why they push loads of anti-Labour propaganda, all that kind of stuff, is because they get money from the Conservatives being in power and they do not want to lose it. In this continual cycle in which they want to be in power for their own financial interests. So, what are they going to do? They're going to try and remove competition. Just like in capital markets, try and remove competitions from themselves as well. This happens in the political system too. That's why the Conservative Party gerrymander. Obviously, Labour have sometimes done that in the past, but not to nearly the same extent as the Conservatives have, because fairness isn't the fairness isn't a word in their lexicon. Hence, why society looks the way it does under this particular political system. Right? This is why. This is why this is being done. It's just completely cynical, and you just have to think, how far are they going to go to be able to cement their majority indefinitely, right? We've already seen them try and bypass the political process by devolving particular governmental decisions down to committee level, where they can't be, we then have to get ratified through the House of Lords, etc., and then bypassing the political process, right? How far have we seen, the hostile takeovers of Labour areas, just like with Joe Anderson being mayor of Liverpool, and then having their council supposed to be run by the government by some kind of detachment from the centralised government, right? It's clearly a bunch of ways in which they are asserting their power through their pretty large majority to be able to bypass the democratic process to keep themselves in power forever. And because they have control over so many institutions, as well as with the democratic institutions, the cultural institutions, and like the financial media institutions, they have the power with which we're able to do this. So I don't think we'll see a Labour government for a very long time if things like these continue. Honestly, not sure how I feel about the ID rule, because I think where I've seen free photo ID available, and my real big issue with photo ID is where voting people might be able to afford a photo ID, i.e. passports. Like, even if free photo ID is available if you apply for it, that's not going to be available on the voting day, which you can still do, right? You can still apply to register to vote online, and then just turn up on polling day and just say, "Here's my registration. I've already registered. Let's just vote." Right? If you need your ID on voting day, it needs to arrive before then that involves a lot more pre-planning, other than just continually being registered to vote, right? They need to process 9 million people to be able to get that to work properly. And, it's still, again, a barrier for people to keep people away from voting. 'Cause as you see, low turnout is always a boon for Conservative parties. Just look at Hartlepool, places like that. Like, I think it's important, and, it also stops young people from voting, because young people are just less likely to have ID, because they're not once they become an adult, they've never had the need for ID previously, so they have to start applying for these things at a later date anyway. Like, they spend their entire lives without an ID for so long, so that means they have to have at least applied for one of these first, rather than plenty of people who've just had this ID for generations and generations, right? Yeah, how many IDs would be delayed for Julius? I'm not going to speculate on just maybe some kind of political trickery involved in this ID process, right? But it's still going to be a barrier that stops people from being able to vote, that does not need to exist. It's fixing a problem that is not there, right? Which is funny that they talk about making, the sanctity of our electoral process. Who's the party who has had investigations into breaking electoral code? Could that be the Conservative Party, and they're not disclosing donations, or getting donated too much, or using political donations for spurious means? I wonder if that could be the case. Or how about lying in as part of their political platform, right? like, they are no stranger to influencing election in nefarious means. So to try and say that this one, like the singular conviction in 2019, is evidence that we need to uproot our democratic process and disenfranchise a huge swathe of the voting public is absolute nonsense, right? It's completely two-faced and hypocritical. I don't like two-quote fallacies too much on my channel. I try to steer away from the appeal to hypocrisy, but it's just so blatant in this case that it makes me infuriated. Like, how are you supposed to deal with this? Like, it's the level of cognitive dissonance is absolutely wild. So, two different things, both announced on the same day, that are both ways in which the Conservatives are trying to solidify their stranglehold on the political process, which, as I said before, completely cynical. One of them is just a change in voting system, which just favours them, which, again, you can't make any moral statements against, but I do think it's still cynical. Whereas one of them is just the disenfranchisement of a whole group of people just because they might not vote in your direction. It's despicable, and I just completely think it's completely indefensible, considering there's just not a problem that exists. So, and you see it happening in America as well. They have like voter ID laws in Georgia and things like that, which were specifically done to stop black people from voting, considering that it was black people who were the swing vote in the Senate elections in Georgia. And also, I guess, not only in the Senate election in Georgia, in the actual state elections in Georgia, but in the presidential elections, because they were the singular blue state that got, changer in Fulton County. Like, you can see this happen across many different times, and there's never, ever, ever, ever been a problem with voter fraud. So just to bang on about, the sanctity of our elections when clearly it's not in any kind of jeopardy is completely transparent on every possible wavelength. Like, come on. Just admit that it is just completely selfish and greedy and anti-democratic, and it's only done to continue to have a stranglehold on the political system. I'd love to see a discussion show structured like a court case with advocates on each side to defend the debaters by objecting to recognised fallacies or incorrect information. Well, that's why I actually quite like debates on YouTube, and why I watch a lot of Vosh. I think it's really, really interesting, and robust debate is good. And I like watching skilled debaters who will call out fallacies. And I see the appeal to hypocrisy so much on the right. It drives me absolutely up the bloody wall that you will just post a picture. I posted a clip on TikTok of Alistair Campbell for his sins, because he has plenty of them, saying that it is bad that the mainstream media are not covering the Peter Stefanovic video of Boris Johnson being proven to lie in Parliament. They're not talking about that on the mainstream media outlets, despite the fact that it's just gross incompetence and gross negligence on the part of the Prime Minister. And they were saying, "Oh, well, do people care?" And he was like, "Well, you're the media. You're supposed to inform people so they can make a decision about whether they care or not, right? You're not supposed to just only show people things they want to see. That would be bad media. That would be bad journalism if that was all people were being shown, right?" But because it was Alistair Campbell making this point, all of the comments were just dodgy dossier, Iraq war, bloody member of, the Labour Party who took us into Iraq. And I'm just like, sure, I agree. Alistair Campbell is bad. He did lots of bad things. But that is not a repudiation of the point that the media having a poorly covering this Peter Stefanovic video proving that Boris Johnson lied in Parliament. It's very clear they have no defence of their figurehead parasocial daddy in the form of Boris Johnson, because the only possible way they have of defending him is attacking the hypocrisy of people who are making legitimate points against him. And again, it is an argumental fallacy, and it happens all the time. And it's like, these people would rather have someone who is just completely open about the fact that their political viewpoints are completely divorced from the political needs of the working class. As long as they're upfront about it, as long as they speak their mind, as long as they say what they mean, and as long as as long as they are act within their own interests, they think that's an upstanding member of the political system. So, for example, Jacob Rees-Mogg, I don't agree with everything he says, but he's not afraid to say it, and I appreciate his honesty. And I was like, he's an honest bellend. He's honest about the fact that he hates you, he hates everything you stand for, and he hates advocating for policies that are in your material interest. So don't support him. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that Emily Thornberry is an extremely rich QC who advocates for social policy. Like, you say, well, she's a millionaire with 2 homes, blah, 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 blah. It's like, I don't give a shit. I don't care how hypocritical she is, as long as she's advocating for policies that make my life better. Like, come on, just think, engage brain. Engage. It's infuriating. Happened with Corbyn as well, obviously. I was like, he's a millionaire, he's lived in Parliament, what does he know about the working life? I'm like, well, sure. I mean, do you like the policies that he represents? Do the vote. Like, it's not difficult. It's not difficult in the slightest. I would very much rather have someone who was grifting for my position than was grifting for my interests than someone who was sincere in their belief against my interests, right? That much rather have that. Like fucking Ryan Knight on Twitter. Sure, he's clearly grifting. He's clearly just taking random Twitter talking points and just agreeing with them for clout. But he's attacking capitalism. So I'd rather have him than him just randomly tweeting things that I agree with that have no substance towards them at all and bringing people on side. Obviously, I disagree with a lot of his cultural things that he says and a lot of critique of social, like people like AOC, etc. But that's a moot point with regards to what I'm actually talking about here. Even if he's just grifting as a socialist, I'm glad at least he's moving people left, right? Rather than, I mean, debate whether he is actually moving people left, but I'd rather him than him doing that rather than just being sincere in an advocation of capitalism or policies that are for bourgeois interests, etc., etc. Like, and ends justify the means as far as I'm concerned. Consequentialists gonna consequentialize. Just made that word. So, I think we have one last piece to cover here, which is a video that was posted in a Facebook group I'm in that we requested that I cover, which is by a channel called... this is a video by a channel called Millennia Thinker, called Toxic Daughters. So the description is: meet toxic daughter. For her, school is a waste of time. For her, work is an abstraction. Distracted by social media, she pays no attention to other matters. For her, strangers from the internet are of greater value than her closest family. Dancing in some literally who rapper music video is the peak height of her career. This seems like excellent political commentary. Let's have a look at what is going on here. If we actually just check the channel for 1 second. All of their video thumbnails are just Wojaks. Nothing but Wojaks. And I'm just like, okay, this is definitely going to be well-reasoned political opinion. Toxic Daughters is definitely a really good punk band name, I'm not going to lie. But this is the video that I was linked. It's only 5 minutes long, so it shouldn't take us very long. Let's have a look at this.
And I tell him that he doesn't even have half of my followers, so he has to piss off.
Anna Maria Wright, get in the car.
Who is that?
My father.
The one who likes feet?
No, the real one.
How long do I have to wait? I am waiting for your explanation.
Like what?
Why weren't you at school today?
I did not feel like it.
You had an exam today for which you studied so much.
I don't care about exams.
So what, are you not going to finish school? Is this another of your brilliant idea?
I don't need school.
So you'll be hanging around at home until I'm gone, and then what?
I'll see.
I'll see, maybe later. You don't think about your future, about security, about ensuring your well-being. Nothing gets to you. Either some naked pictures on the internet or you run around in my house with confetti gun and your poor mother has to clean it up afterwards.
How does this channel have 280,000 subscribers? They've put in so much effort into animating this. This would go down really well on Newgrounds. Like, this is very Newgrounds style animation. But just like these random text speeches, how is this popular?
What happened to you? Don't you realize that you are almost an adult? I arranged tutoring for you so you could have an advantage in school and you do nothing with that. How many children did not get the same chance from life as you? How do you repay us? Waving your ass to the camera to the delight of some perverts? That's not how I and your mother raised you.
Oh, right. It's bad because she does OnlyFans. Oh no, what a shame. Moral decline of the country. Oh no.
Sorry.
It's very strawman-y.
Take this.
What is it?
Eye contacts.
What do I need them for?
In my work they find out about your photos, so I told them that it's not you and you have green eyes. Wear them when one of my friends comes to our house.
I don't want to.
Well, it's that hard for you to do this for me now? What are we going to tell your mother?
Nothing.
So you just going to lock yourself in a room so that we can detach themselves from you? Do you only need us for this? So you could sleep in our house and eat at our table? What will happen next? What if we're gone? Because if you don't want to finish school, you must go to work. And I do not know if some princess like you can find a well-paid profession without any school.
I'll be rich anyway.
I wonder how?
I have many followers.
What?
People watching me on the internet.
You were supposed.
What if phones, but too much? Children bad because internet. Very, very lukewarm social critique. This is terrible. It's so bad.
To delete this account.
It's not that. It's a different platform.
I do not understand.
These are short videos, sometimes funny, sometimes wholesome. Hence the confetti.
Oh. And can you earn from this?
Well, if you do live streams or have sponsors.
And when will you have these sponsors?
Maybe tomorrow? Maybe in a year?
Maybe in 10 years. What are you talking about? Just go to work now and don't expect everything to be given for you on a silver plate.
I don't think so. If you think I will be fine working day after day and then earning as little as you are, then you are blatantly mistaken.
I earn good money.
No, you don't. We can't afford traveling, cars, flights to Europe for shopping weekends.
What car are you talking about?
Turns out, right, that life for the working class isn't great under capitalism. And clearly this... I don't know what to say. This is just it's just so nonsensical.
Do you think this is how life is? That people sit on deck chairs, all their days drinking margaritas while being lazy? This is not what life looks like. When you grow up, you will understand that sometimes it does not matter how much you earn, but whether people respect you. Because what if you can fly back and forth on a private plane and then you can't even meet people's eyes? If
What? I mean, if the substantive criticism is that being rich won't make you happy, I'm just like, well, a certain amount of wealth makes you optimal happiness. We have actual data on this, that it plateaus at about, what's it, like $100,000 or something? The level of happiness at which making all of your material needs be essentially none of your worries, taking all the worry away from existence and giving you the point at which you're not worried about moving paycheck to paycheck, right? Like, that's the maximum level of happiness that can be given you by material means. But outside of that, any more rich that you get, it doesn't make you any happier. But like, the idea that this girl is disillusioned with the idea of the world of work under neoliberal capitalism, it's not she's fine to be alienated from the labour that that they want to make her do. Like, just saying, kids these days only want to be Instagram influencers and YouTubers. I'm like, true, I do want to be a YouTuber, but I also have a job. like the idea that there are just girls just like refusing to get jobs just because they want to be Instagram influencers is just nonsense. It's just some misogynist's idea of what thing actually happens. Old man yells at OnlyFans model. Yeah, I'm just like, it's fucking selling a picture on the internet. Who cares?
They mock you because you make yourself a laughingstock on the internet.
I'd rather be a laughingstock and be rich than working half of my life and have nothing like you. No one.
Based. I do not care if people laugh at me as long as I don't have to work a fucking dreary 9-to-5 job for a third of my existence. I would much people randomly laughing at me for some perceived other reason about my moral character does not faze me. What does faze me is wasting a third of my existence having my labour extracted for capital by a bullshit company.
Mr. Sissy is laughing at you. Admit it, Dad. You're just jealous that we have the opportunity to achieve something in a young age, and you have grown old with the thought that soon someone will notice you in your stupid little job, so you can finally be rewarded, but they didn't care about you after all.
I don't know who put such stupid things into your head, some crap about easy fame and money, but it's not true. And that you have the nerve to mock your parents who have sacrificed so much for you. I work 2 shifts to cover your education and you sneak out at night and go to strangers for parties, and then your poor mother has to look for you all by herself, alone, at night, and next day you just think we can brush it off like always? We gave you too much, we thought it would be for the best, but still not enough for you. You still want more, you will use us because you know there will be no consequences, but believe me they will be.
Where are we?
Now you can do whatever you want. She's all yours.
It's not salad fingers, is it? What? What the fuck did they just say there? Hang on a minute. When complete strangers become our closest friends, lovers, and protectors, and the people who gave birth to you become an obstacle of our... then become an obstacle of our failure. What? That sentence doesn't... That doesn't even make any sense. This sentence is completely... It's nonsensical. And like, if they're your closest friends and lovers and protectors, that means they're not strangers anymore. If it's trying to say that, oh, you know people on the internet, and I'm just like, okay, internet communities are not that different to IRL communities. You just speak with people, you still form bonds with people, you just don't talk face to face. I mean, sometimes you even do. There's video chat that exists. Like, this is such a hollow critique of some what if phones, but too much. Like, it's a nonsense. People give money to this person? Wow. Was it just like, yeah, you think you can make it rich by doing videos on the internet? God, what a ridiculous possible notion that people might grow up to be rich off making videos on the internet. This person is making money for videos on the internet. The level of cognitive dissonance is so wild. This was an experience. Dancing in some literally who rapper music videos because how much money does this person make a month on Patreon? $59 patrons, okay. So they're not making enough to actually... Let's have a look at the comments. Let's see if I can get at least some amount of ideas of what's going on in the comments. I noticed this whole cult of celebrities and interest in someone else's life is mostly done by women. Why? I mean, not really. I think most influencers are kind of equal across both genders. Like, you look at like the YouTube sphere. There's plenty of like popular YouTube influencers who are men as well as women. Like, I don't. Like that, you've shown me no empirical data to show that this is the case. Millennia thinker, like, and also the cult of celebrities is a product of capitalism. They're trying to sell you shit. Hates men, but is dependent on them. It's just a straw man. I'm a teenage boy who tries his best at studying understanding parents' problems, yet this video still got me off guard with its idea. What? I'm going to go mad. It's like, kids these days don't even listen to their bloody parents. It's a nuisance generation. Just like every generation said about the other generation's children. What a novel idea, the idea that one generation hates their other generation's children. Who could have thought of such a thing? Like, kids are naturally rebellious. They always have been. Like, come on, get to the real world. Back when I was still a small kid, I never thought about the consequences of actions, pushing problems to others. Have it helped anyone? the fact that people like this exist in real life makes me sad and mad at the same time. They just don't. Like, this is a complete straw man. Finally, this he has the thinker in his channel name. Yeah, has such a fucking brain dead take. It's like when you see a channel with truth in the name, it's almost always batting pure bullshit. True, 100% true. Yeah, the truth about XYZ is always fucking bollocks. In Minecraft, I don't know. I don't know if me saying fucking is Twitch. I think it probably is. He's right that you need to understand the consequence of your actions and need to take proper steps to have a life that's even worth living. She's right that if you're not rich and you're not saving, your job doesn't care about you, probably underpays you, so you support your kids, then go up to do the exact same thing. This person understands that this is a problem with capitalism. And like this is just like a very, very normal take. Just say, think about the consequences of your actions. That's a reasonable moral philosophy, right? But that's not what's being described in the video is not a fair representation of how reality works. Come on. But this take here that slaving away at the job doesn't care about you and probably underpays you is bad. Like, something turns out capitalism is rubbish. It's almost like the desire for this generation to want to change the system to make it so that it is easier for people to have lives worth living is a prop to our generation, because they understand that this second part here about slaving away at a job is not fun. Like, they are well aware of this, right? It scares me to think I could be a father of a daughter like her someday. Probably not, mate. Probably not. Mike's just literally said she's going to have a sponsor today. Why can't I have a normal family? Define normal. Okay, if my mother thinks this is bad, do you think school is useless now because she has a sponsor, right? Well, not really. Well, she doesn't have one, so she said she will, but the sponsor saw how bad she looked and rejected her. Now she's got no future job planned and is doing school, although very reluctantly. Yeah, she previously might have had a job lined up and then didn't, so now she's going back to school. That happens with people who leave school at 16 as well. Like, there's nothing new. Like, being given job prospects that then fall through at that age and then leaving school and then coming back. Like, you can just do that. That's not a repudiation of this existence. Well, that was a ride. That was quite the ride. I was not expecting something that ridiculous to have to watch, but hey ho, we had a good laugh at the silly video. Okay, it's now 11 o'clock, and I can hear people going to bed, and I'm talking quite loud. So I'm probably going to call it there. It's a good stream, actually. Got a good 2.5 hours to stream out of that. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening. Hope you all take care and stay safe. If you could just go and like and subscribe, ring the bell, Facebook, Twitch, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and I think that's all of my media platforms. And please like and or subscribe to. You have to subscribe onto it. You have to give me money. Just engage with the content. I'm glad you enjoyed the stream. I need to do more kind of politics streams. Glad that Vosh wasn't on tonight, so I actually had the chance to be able to stream. But we'll see. Thank you very much for tuning in, guys. I do appreciate it.